Okay, I think we're ready to begin again. I am still Catherine Ott, a curator here at the museum. Does everyone, can everyone see, hear, have tactile access? We have assistive listening devices, and we have volunteers on hand to assist if you need a device. We have assistive listening devices also available in the back. So session 2 in the conversations on Latinos and disability in the ADA is beginning now. The topic for the next hour or so is the history of cultural issues related to disability and Latinos and Latinas. And as I mentioned at the last session, all of this is of a piece. They're not large distinctions among the questions and answers of the conversations we're having. But we'll try to, it was one way to try to focus what was going to happen this afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, John McKiernan-Gonzalez, who's a professor of history at Texas State University in San Marcos. He's going to moderate this session and the following one. He and I have worked together for a while on this project of creating opportunities for conversations around Latinos and disability. The two panelists we're really pleased and honored to have with us are Rene David Luna, disability rights activist, coordinator for immigrants at Access Living in Chicago, one of the oldest and most active independent living centers, and they're like awesome and world-renowned. And Brigida Hernandez, who's a PhD director of research at YAI Network in New York and has been working on this topic for a long time as well as a researcher. So I'm turning it over to John, and he will take it from here. Thank you all for coming again. I know I keep thanking you, but we're so happy to be doing this and to have you all here with us while this is happening and participating in it.
Primero, buenas tardes. Bienvenidos. Good afternoon, everybody. Les quiero dar las gracias a los trabajadores de ADMIRIS por venir aquí y participar en estas conversaciones. I'd like to thank the workers who came here from Honduras to discuss injuries and disabilities here with us. They've come a long way, and I'd like to say I'm so glad that they could make it, because having them here really points to the connection between work, labor, and injury. And I think when people think about disabilities, people don't connect disabilities to life. So what I'd like to do right now is sort of like segue into the thing. It's like, how did you get involved in disabilities?
I'm going to go first.
I could start. So saludos a todos. I'm so happy to be here today. I became involved almost by accident with disability research when I was a graduate student. I ended up in Chicago thinking I was going to end up being a clinical psychologist, and my very first semester became involved in research on a community level with Fabricio Balcazar, who was the speaker before us, over at the University of Illinois at Chicago. It was back in '94 that he was funded for a project to educate the Latino community on the Americans with Disabilities Act. It had just got enacted, and we were aware that very few Latinos knew about this law. So what we ended up doing was working in, if you're familiar with Chicago, in the communities of Pilsen and Little Village. Then we moved into Humboldt Park and really did a lot of door-to-door education with business owners. Do you know about this law? And if you know about it, can you tell us what you know about it? And if you don't know about it, let us educate you. We started off with graduate students, sort of being the educators. Then we moved on using participatory methods where we had people with disabilities involved in our project. And it was just a fascinating 3 years for me. And I never went back to clinical psychology. I ended up doing disability research from that moment on. And I really thank Fabricio for being a mentor during that time. Ended up doing work with Rene Luna and Access Living on employment issues and disabilities, then Horacio. We ended up doing a couple of disability studies related projects looking at accessibility issues. And I do less research, and I'm more in the service provision area of disability, but more looking at it from a program evaluation point of view. So if we're getting money from the federal government to deliver services, to what extent are our services effective? Do they really result in change? And right now our big thing is quality of life. Are we improving the quality of lives of the people that receive our services?
Okay. Well, I am the grandson of my grandfather. He came to work in the steel mills in the 1930s in Indiana, Inland Steel, and he was part of the labor movement. I think a lot of people know the struggle for steel workers to have a shorter workday and better pay and better benefits. And I think that taught me a lot. Local 1010 was one of the most active unions in the country, and Chicago and the area here in Illinois, I'm sure in other parts, where there was a lot of labor activism. I ended up working at the steel mills. I didn't like high school very much, and kind of rebelled and didn't attend very often. So I went to work in the steel mills, and later, unexpectedly, I had a car accident. And it was, at the time, the worst thing in the world. All I knew about disability was what happened to the kids down the block who had cognitive disability. And I couldn't even play with them because I wasn't allowed to. And there were, to the church I went to, there were people, older woman with a disability who used a wheelchair. We used to help her carry her up the steps when I was a teenager. So that's all I knew about disability, so very limited knowledge and even fear, to be honest. But after my accident, I recovered. I went through rehab, got my GED, went to school, really went through some transformation, really developed some consciousness about myself, about my abilities, and my interests. And I developed political philosophy and ideology, and that helped me to grow, and it really helped to shape who I am and my belief systems and my sense of equality that I don't think I would have had if I hadn't had a disability. So then I became involved. I wanted to go to graduate school, but hadn't been independent very much and faced difficulty living independently at the universities. And so I got involved with the disability rights movement in the middle 80s when we were fighting for mainline transportation in Chicago, and I know in other parts of the country, Dept was fighting for accessible buses. Now, almost everywhere we have accessible public transportation, but it's not only because of the ADA, but it's because of the struggle that disabled people were involved with in the 1980s to get access to the buses. In Chicago, we took a different approach than other cities. We obviously blocked buses and raised havoc at the Chicago Transit Authority board meetings, but we also filed a complaint. There wasn't much legal obligations for the local transit authorities at that time because Reagan had said that under Section 504, it was up, President Reagan, I should say, 504 was open to be interpreted by each local transit agency. So we didn't have much federal protection there, but we had a Human Rights Act in Illinois, and we filed a complaint there. We also worked with the mayor, then Mayor Harold Washington, who appointed a person with a disability to the board of the Chicago Transit Authority. So he worked on the inside, trying to change the way that the board members felt about having an accessible main line. We worked on the outside, creating havoc, and we had the legal support. So that was part of our approach. And I really began to develop a disability rights consciousness during that time. Previously, I had a political philosophy, but I didn't have the disability rights philosophy, independent living movement philosophy. And then I started working at Access Living, and I became more broadly involved in independent living. And I've worked on various topics like education. Currently, I'm working on an employment program. I have an activist group called Disabled Americans Want Work Now, and it's grassroots. I've worked on immigration broadly, not only in the Latino community, but with Asian communities, Polish, Jewish communities. So, I think it's helped to broaden my perspective, and I think the immigration issue has taken me out of the box, the traditional way of thinking about disability, that even within the independent living movement, we're somewhat stuck in our own way, and we kind of think it's a one-size-fits-all independent living movement philosophy, and it isn't. And when we look at cultures, and we look at different countries and their histories, their socioeconomic conditions, we have a different and a richer understanding of what people's lives are about.
Well, that's a really elegant segue into the question I'm supposed to ask, which is, how do you think Latinos understand disability? And what are some of the biggest challenges that face Latinos around disability? But you're in Chicago, you're in New York. In what ways do you think the Chicago context shapes the way that Latinos understand disability? In what way do you think the New York or New Jersey context shapes the way that Latinos understand disability?
Want to go first?
Do you want to start? Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think in Chicago, we've worked on in the Latino disability community for a while. Back in the early 80s, there was an organization in Chicago called El Valor that was led by a Mrs. Guadalupe Reyes, who had a family with a disability, child with cognitive disabilities. So she started fighting for the schools to be more accessible and to provide better services, provide more accommodations to children with disabilities who are Latino, who faced not only the disability issues that needed to be addressed, but also the language issues. They got involved with other parts of the country, and there was an organization called Fiesta Educativa, which many of you might be aware of, that it's primarily in the Southwest, in California, Arizona, Texas. So we became a chapter, and I became involved with them in about 1988. And what I saw was that it was mainly led by professionals and parents. And I was the only person on the board. Well, there was another gentleman who was on the board who had a disability. And we began to argue and to insist that we needed to have a larger role within Fiesta Educativa and within the community. And we brought a different perspective on disability than what parents had and what professionals had. And we changed the bylaws to require that the governing board of our local chapter of Fiesta Educativa was 1/3 persons with disabilities, 1/3 parents, and 1/3 professionals. Now, in the disability community here, it's, especially at independent living centers, it's majority persons with disabilities. So this was even somewhat different from the independent living model. But it would be more difficult to insist at that time that it be primarily led by people with disabilities. Plus, we are more family-oriented and community-oriented, collectively oriented. So having everyone involved, I think, was a plus. And I think that helped to shape the way professionals looked at disabilities. It helped to shape the way parents looked at people with disabilities, because parents no longer had to rely on the expertise of the professionals. And now they could see some mentors. They could see some people who were achieving with a disability, and that helped change consciousness. So I think that began some cultural change there. And then the networking and the community organizing that took place afterwards, along with that, at the same time, part of that dynamic, working with Horacio and working with others, getting involved with Proyecto Visión. I think that, you know, there's been more awareness about Latinos with disabilities and the unique struggles of Latinos with disabilities.
You know, I was living in Chicago for 15 years before I relocated to the New York City area. That was about 7 years ago. And I have to say, during that span that I was in Chicago, I almost felt like the movement, although grassroots, was stronger, more unified in terms of gathering people from diverse groups, but also the Latino community together to fight for common issues. One example I can highlight is that in Chicago, you guys just had your 12th Disability Pride Parade. New York City just had their first. So when I came to New York City, I was sort of expecting that community to be there. And I have to say, it's not as strong. It's there, but I think it's siloed. I'm forgetting who made that comment. It may have been Kathy or Catherine, where the groups aren't united. It is sort of, what group do you provide services to? And that's the group you're focusing in on. So for my organization, we focus on individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And we don't really see other types of disabilities when we do have advocacy efforts that we're engaging in. And I think we could be doing a better job at it. And I think Chicago, having had that experience, it made me realize we still have a lot of work to do.
Now, I'm going to go a lot to sort of the cities, in ways to like think about Latinos in cities and Latinos being part of the broader experience. So one of the things that's, I think, really interesting to people who aren't from Chicago is seeing that the houses in Chicago are sometimes beneath the streets. Sort of like the opening is here, the entrance is here, and very much part of that. But also, when people talk about Chicago, it's being the city of neighborhoods. And there's a really rich sort of like street life that happens in Chicago. And the last thing you mentioned in your discussing how you came to disability, part of it was experiencing disability in the church. What roles do you see, let's say, for church, whether it's Catholic, Protestant, or staying asleep on Sunday morning church, and neighborhoods shape the experience of disability for the communities that you work with, and of course yourselves?
Okay. Well, religion and disability have somewhat of a conflictual relationship for many of us in the disability community, because of the idea that people with disabilities maybe did something wrong, they're being punished, and also if it's not that perspective that's pervasive anymore, at least there's a charity model that kind of springs from those some religious views. I'm not knocking anybody's religion, it just happens. I mean, particularly in Latino culture, we talk about caridad, and you know, charity is not a bad thing, it's a good thing. But here in the U.S. and in Chicago, many people with disabilities don't like a charity model because if there's visions of people being beggars and asking for money, being handouts, remember the older term that we used to have, handicap, having that cap in hand. So that type of thinking predominates in some Latino communities and cultures, and the churches, I think, depending on their philosophies, their religious views, and how they interpret gospel, for example, some may be more empowering, and others more paternalistic. So I think that's some of the challenges involved. But for those that have, I think one thing that's common for most is a welcoming, wanting to open the doors. I've seen more churches becoming accessible, wheelchair accessible in particular, and there are services for the deaf. This isn't simply a movement of people in wheelchairs or physical disabilities. In Chicago in particular, there were people who were deaf and hard of hearing who organized. The parents were involved. People from Ecuador and from other parts of Central America and Mexico and South America. So, it's people coming out, so to speak. There is that process of coming out. That's very important. But they see that welcoming, that opportunity, that if somebody else is doing it, I could do it too, kind of mentality.
It's sort of understanding it, and it was mentioned at the first session, helping churches, but other groups too, that there is the medical lens that continues, where individuals are looking at the disability community through a deficit model approach. The individuals need to be fixed. So now sort of our task is, how do we shift that over to a social political model where it's, well, actually they don't need to be fixed. How do we fix the environment that they live in? How do we fix policies that impact them? And I think there's still a lot of work to be done in that arena, especially in poorer communities, communities that are underserved, that are under-resourced. There is this education piece that needs to occur, but also this activism that needs to occur on a grassroots level so that people could be educated, that there is a different lens you can be looking at this issue from.
Okay. I wanted to add one thing about the religious point of view too. And sometimes it's somebody's viewpoint that you have to have piedad towards somebody who's less than you are, and to appreciate their experience. And piedad is a good thing for the most part. But pity can also have its negative components, because you begin to look down at people, and you begin to look at people as being different. And maybe that's one of the problems we have in society, not only here, but everywhere, that we look at disability as something that happens to somebody else. And if you're not disabled, you don't need to worry about it. And that's a problem, because disability happens to anybody at any time. And so that us versus them kind of mentality happens. But the pity approach creates this hierarchy, and that's part of the problem. We don't look at each other as equals. And it's very subconsciously, I think. Maybe people don't intentionally do that, but because of things they learned about disability through religion or their experiences in their community, they see the plight, quote unquote, of those people with disabilities. And so that something that happens there is this kind of fear sets in. We've heard it in religious terms, therefore the grace of God go I. And that's a really interesting concept. God is somehow protecting us who don't have disabilities. And, that's demeaning and devaluing to many people who have disabilities. but we don't understand it. Unless we discuss it, we dialogue about it, and people with disabilities speak up about those perceptions, those myths, those stereotypes don't get torn down. We don't change consciousness.
So if I could share a story, I don't know if you remember this, Rene,
Yeah,
but we actually went to the Puerto Rican Day Parade in Chicago, and my mom wanted to come with us, and so we went. And so my mom had met Rene for the very first time, and afterward, I went out, had lunch with my mom or dinner, and she goes, "Oh, I really had a good time con tu amigo enfermito." And there became a moment that I could have a discussion with her. And it was sort of a generational discussion because she is much older and from sort of a different mindset. But moving forward, it's Rene. So it's interesting, had I not had that discussion with her, she would have continued using that term, enfermito. Well, no, he's not the sick one. His name actually is Rene. But she didn't say it with sort of malicious intent. It became an opportunity to have dialogue, and I don't think we have enough of that.
The other thing about Chicago is that you have Mexican neighborhoods and Puerto Rican neighborhoods and Cuban enclaves and Colombian enclaves, and then people draw generalizations about Mexicans or Puerto Ricans or Colombians based on their experiences of the city. So now I'm going to ask you to sort of like see if you see any broad differences based on your experiences in the disability rights movement, in the labor movement, as a Latino, across cultures. I say that as someone who's deeply skeptical about the word culture because I'm a historian and we're all individuals, but there are maybe broad patterns that you see in your work.
Well, I think there's a lot of universal concepts in terms of stereotypes and myths about disabilities. They're not unusual to the United States, to Mexico, Central America, even Europe, or Russia, or China, Asian countries. The myths are there. I think there's some history that we might trace that go back over time that are part of labeling that occurred when people no longer were valued as part of the economy and part of the community. Their existence in the community may have been accepted, but their value, their labor value within economy, within industrialized society, changed. So in order to take care of people, we need to develop welfare programs, rehabilitation programs, services, institutions. And that's what many people faced, getting into those institutions. And that happens almost everywhere. What I understand about Mexico is that many people with mental illness get locked up and thrown into very bad institutions. That happened here, it's still happening. Institutional thinking occurs when you really want to get rid of somebody, when a society would rather not look at people, not want to deal with it. We do it with prisons now, with young people, with people of color, Latinos. We don't want to deal with the social issues that are so important, the economic issues, the jobs issues. We'd rather discard people. And I think those are some of the factors and forces involved in the way we think about disability and have colored the way societies look at disability. And that's not a cultural perspective.
Yeah.
And I agree with you. I'm skeptical. In the disability community, we talk about disability culture. And I'm not sure what that means entirely. But I do understand that there's important contributions in the arts and in poetry and theater, and that people are expressing their identities, their experiences. That I could understand as a disability culture. but it's not a unified culture. So we have that diversity even within our own community.
Well, it's funny that you use the word fixed, because as a historian, you know, anything before 1980 is deeply fascinating to me. Everything after 1980 is just backdrop to what happened before 1980. It's a really backwards way of looking at the world. And when you said the word fix, it reminded me kind of like of the institutional history of Mexican Americans or Latinos or what have you in California in terms of how people tried to get fixed or tried to get the next generation fixed. And there's been some work by Alexandra Stern and Natalie Lira that counted the 17,000 sterilizations that happened in California institutions from 1910 to about 1965. And she found that of these 17,000 cases, maybe 7,000 of them challenged the sterilizations. And of these 7,000 of the challenges, 70% were Mexican American and the other 30% were of Italian descent. So as someone who's skeptical of religion and skeptical of patterns, there was a clear pattern there. But it also points to sort of like the hidden history of those are Latinos and these are people who are disabled in these state institutions. Now, all these things, let's say maybe stopped, maybe you're continuing. My question is, you've discussed Harold Washington, and I was wondering sort of like how have sort of like surrounding social movements shaped your understanding or surrounding policies shaped your understanding of your work with cognitively disabled families? And then back to you.
So I just wanted to reflect back on your mentioning of all the individuals who had been sterilized during that time period and just maybe reflect on how times have changed moving forward. I mentioned that I work for a nonprofit and we serve about 20,000 individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities. A large portion of them are adults, and we actually have an education piece, but then also a practice piece where we do sexual consenting of adults. And if individuals want to be married and they want children, they are supported through that process. So just as a reflection of, I'm not saying that it is something that is pervasive, but I know within our organization it's something that we've become more aware of and more attuned to, sort of as the flip side to that. And when I think about the community of those with cognitive and intellectual disabilities, I think out of all the disability groups, it's probably the one that's been, I don't want to use the word neglected, but when I think about the ADA and I think about what's written in law and accommodations, it's very sort of physical or sensory. There's very little discussion, although I think we've improved in recent years, on how to make accommodations for those with intellectual cognitive disabilities. It is something that if I could say let's improve, that would be where the improvement needs to happen. And I know within our organization and others like us, there's a big education piece to it where we need to really educate the individuals we serve about the history of this law in language that is simple to understand. Because when you look at the Act, and as someone who worked on a project related to the ADA for about 7 years, it's a complex law. Like, what do we mean by reasonable accommodations? What is undue hardship? What are places of public accommodations? And this is language that if you're not exposed to on a daily basis and fully understand, you sort of miss. So when I think about the community that I work with now closely and the work that needs to be done, that's where I think the challenge lies, but opportunities also exist ahead.
Yeah, and you mentioned Mayor Harold Washington. Some of you may not be from Chicago and may not know the history, but Mayor Washington was the first African-American mayor in Chicago. And that was important, not only because he was a person of color, but because he had a broader vision of change in the city, one that went away from a typical machine politics. the traditional machine politics where the few always benefited, the privileged always benefited, particularly the downtown area, the corporations, the businesses, the political machines that existed there, political elites scamming the system, more or less. He wanted to transform that. He wanted to give more power to the community, to communities, to individuals in communities, to working class people. He wanted to change that dynamic. So it was not only a political transformation, but an economic, socioeconomic one that he was seeking. And that history was very important. And he saw the broad diversity and inclusion that needed to occur and included people with disabilities. Many of us were excited and involved in the movement to elect Harold Washington. It's easy to say afterwards that he is the first African-American mayor in Chicago, but you have to understand the background, the backstory on it. People in communities began to fight. They became united. They became excited about political change. They knew that there was an opportunity to transform Chicago, and that was powerful. So it empowered individuals, it empowered communities, that whole movement, a progressive movement in Chicago. And we recently resurrected that type of movement under a candidate who, unfortunately from my perspective, did not win, was Latino, Chuy Garcia. Some of you may have heard in the news, even though you're from other parts of the country. Chuy is someone that we had worked with. I had met him when he was in the General Assembly, state senator, and he had always been open. As a matter of fact, the Latino delegation in Springfield had been open to issues of disability because we were talking to them about our issues, about the needs to change the education system, the social services system, the barriers that occurred. He later on became a commissioner. Actually, after Harold Washington passed, the old machine regained power, and that's where we're at now. But where there's still movement for change. And I think one of the unique aspects of Chicago is that within the disability community, many of us who have a political framework, a political ideology, we become involved in other movements and other issues so that we're not focused solely on disability. We see the intersections that occur. So immigrants with disabilities, African Americans with disabilities, Latinos, gay and lesbian and transgendered people with disabilities. We're a diverse community. We're a reflection of the community. We are a community. We shouldn't even be separating ourselves from community. We are the community.
Oh, I was looking to Bridget, I forgot that we were following up on these things. This is me playing the clumsy professor, so I apologize for that. I was wondering, one of the things that sort of like talking about immigration and Latinos and disability is, of course, Latinos, one of the ways we justify our presence here is that we work really hard for wages that are not as rewarding as other people. And the other flip side of immigration is likely to become a public charge. Like, you're going to come to this country, you're going to be a burden on society, and as a result, you shouldn't be allowed into this country. And the language has changed, but you can still hear echoes of this. But despite sort of like the hostility to Latin Americans or Latinos in the United States since the 1980s, the Latino immigrant community in the United States has been growing in leaps and bounds. It's been going from a community that was majority US born to mostly mixed status families. How has immigration, your grandfather worked in the steel mill, so you have a real Chicago Latino perspective. How has these new neighbors and new friends and new members of your community, how has that changed the work that you're doing? And has that even changed the way you think of disability?
I mean, we have just seen tremendous growth of different Latino groups coming to our agency for services. It's been amazing. I've only been there 7 years, and every year we host a Latino conference, all in Spanish. And to see the auditorium grow year after year after year, I would say the first year I was there, maybe 100 individuals. So these are adults, but also family members, parents. I would say our last one, we had close to 300 individuals. It's a free all-day event, all in Spanish. And I would say the number one issue that gets talked about is, how can I get services that I may not be qualified for? And it's probably the toughest question for us to answer. It is our biggest challenge. So from a service provider point of view, I would say that's the biggest impact in the New York City area. We're seeing those numbers grow. And as an agency that is 99% funded by Medicaid, and that's how we provide services, we just aren't able to provide services to everyone unless they are Medicaid beneficiaries. So it's been a huge, huge challenge.
I'm sure that's the way it is in many parts of the country. It's interesting, though, the need for education and awareness, even within the immigrant rights community. You know, many immigrants come here to work. They don't come here with a disability. They incur an injury, whether it's in the workplace or crossing the street. We know of instances where a guy who's undocumented was selling hot dogs on the street. He didn't have a disability, but because of a drive-by shooting, he ends up in the hospital now as a disability. Parents come here, they're working, they have a child with a disability that's born, and what happens? You know, are they now U.S. citizens? The child is a U.S. citizen, entitled to go to school, entitled to some services. But what happens when they age out of school? So these are important problems that we have to deal with. But I think we need to educate more of the immigrant rights community. And I think that's been happening, at least in Chicago. We've been networking. I think the immigrant rights community has somewhat of a fear of disability because there's obvious backlashes towards immigrants. We've seen massive deportations in the past few years. And we see opposition in Congress and other political leaders who exploit things, and community leaders that, you know, raise racial hatred issues. And so I think that's enough of a burden for the activist community to deal with, the immigrant activist community to deal with. But then they want to talk about the impacts that, the positive impacts that immigrants are having as hard workers and being productive and contributing to economy, contributing taxes. But with disability, there's an association of burden, and that there's cost involved. So I think many immigrant rights communities, activists, don't want to deal with the disability question because of this issue of cost. And again, that's because of their perspective even, because they don't have disabilities, that disability is a burden. And I've always felt that the biggest type of discrimination that people with disabilities faces, it's not simply cultural or attitudinal stereotypes or anything like that. It's economics. That's what really drives people out. You know, if you're a person with a disability and have a nice income, you know, you're not going to feel the levels of discrimination. But if you're poor and have a disability, your ability to participate in society is decreased, and you're marginalized. And that's the problem with having a disability, whether you're Latino, person of color, gay, lesbian, transgendered. and the impacts even between gender, women, and men with disabilities. All these factors, there's crossover issues, but we need to work with the immigrants community. I think Congress has kind of a love-hate relationship with it when it comes to disability, and particularly in law, because interestingly enough, the ADA was passed under a Republican president. Section 504 of the Rehab Act was passed, and the Rehabilitation Act of '73 was passed under a Republican president. But those are different times. The political atmospheres change. Congress changes. Their knowledge about disability changes. So it's very important for us to educate political leaders, our elected leaders, and to be involved in politics. But many of us are so skeptical. So some of that we have to take on ourselves. We have to carry the ball forward and push the ball forward up that mountain, up those hills, because it's a struggle, but we have to do it.
So, and these are actually not, these are conversations that you've had with actual immigrant rights organizers. This is not, or I guess with Horacio over here. But how do you see sort of like a way to get the immigrant rights to change their ideas about what, like, I could be next, or my child could be next, or my partner could be next?
I think it's changing every day because it happens to people every day. We don't have to do anything there. People change their consciousness about disability, I think, when they incur or deal with, have to have some association, deeper association with disability, firsthand knowledge. But you know, we've been involved in the marches. Horacio with one of the more famous marches in the country, where we had hundreds of thousands of people marching for immigration rights. Disabled people were involved. We've been part of the lead in those marches. I always get skeptical, though, because within the leaders of the marches, they're always wanting to segregate us into one area. This is where the handicapped people go, you know. And I don't like that. I like to be everywhere. And, you know, they'll say, well, you're going to be marching and people won't be able to keep up. I'll keep up. Well, people are going to be rushing over you, pushing you around. No, they won't. They don't. They respect me. So there's kind of these preconceived ideas about how people with disabilities will function and relate. But that's changing. The more we're involved, the more change we create. You know, I think it's vital that this spreads, that these ideas spread into every part of the country, you know, particularly where there's enclaves of Latinos with disabilities. You know, we haven't talked much about what the experience is in Latin America. I've seen change over the years in Mexico. I visited Mexico when a friend of mine, she's Latina with a disability. She was from Cuernavaca, and she married a co-worker of mine, a white guy, very progressive white guy. And they got married in Cuernavaca, so I went down there for the wedding. And there were disabled activists who came from Guanajuato. And how did they get there? They climbed on the bus. They threw their chair on the bus, and they got on. The bus was not accessible, but they got their family or their friends to help them, and they got on the bus. And I know from my family's from Irapuato, Guanajuato. Part of those of you who are from Mexico know a city called León. I went there and I saw curb cuts, and it wasn't by coincidence. It wasn't that they were following any laws. It was because the activists there in Mexico had fought for them. There was wheelchair parking, although nobody was ever complying with the rules there. And no police officers were enforcing the rules. but there was activism. In Nicaragua, I had the opportunity to go there in 1989. The Sandinistas were still in power, and I was going there for what turned out to be a historic event. Chamorro beat the Sandinistas. And that was a result of U.S. influence in that part of the world. We could talk about Honduras, about El Salvador, and other parts, Guatemala, and what our U.S. imperialism, I'm sorry to say, and that was very sad, because when I went to Nicaragua, to Managua, I visited a war museum where the parents, the families of the deceased, of those that were killed during the war, they had their pictures and their helmets and their artifacts. And it was very sad because my country contributed to that. And I didn't feel good about being an American, sorry to say. And we have to understand this global connections, these international relationships that we have, that the United States plays a major role in the way other countries are shaped economically and politically. And that impacts people with disabilities. Nobody ever thinks about that. But because in Latin American countries, there are no social services. There's very little opportunity to go to school for many kids in many areas. They don't have maybe adequate housing. ADA, what would that mean to somebody? Think about that. So when people are coming here, there's no sense of real expectation or of sense of rights or entitlement, the way those of us who live here, what we have. So that's part of our challenge, right? Those of us who are working with immigrants, empowering folks, explaining some of these changes and opportunities that exist.
So I thought you were going to add Puerto Rico to that list.
Puerto Rico, we went to Puerto Rico.
Together,
Oh.
and we were concerned about accessibility issues. It had been a number of years since I had been there. This was post-ADA, and for the most part, I think there were a little quirk here and there in terms of, but overall, able to travel.
Remember, I was worried about transportation. I was told that I could be picked up in a door-to-door service at the airport. So I used that service, and it cost me about $25 or $30 to get from the airport to the hotel. And then when I'm there, they said, well, why didn't you take a bus? I said, you mean you have accessible buses in Puerto Rico? Yes, we do. And so I rode an accessible bus in Puerto Rico. And the bus drivers were on strike, one of the lines. So, I wanted to respect their union and their workers' rights. But, they went out of the way to accommodate me. One time a bus broke down. They got a bus specially for me, although I just like the term special.
Yeah.
And in many of our countries, son especiales, we had an organization called Latinos Unidos para Niños Especiales, and I didn't particularly like that term because special to me means segregation. We have special Olympics, special housing, special services, special transportation. Back in my office, we had a special board, and we kept special stories about the special things that special people did. That was a very special board.
Brigida, I was wondering if you could talk about give some examples of how your work with families, with some people who are cognitively disabled, how those conversations go. I know Fabricio talked about people don't know what to ask for, and of course, what is a reasonable accommodation? Lawyers can debate that endlessly. How do those conversations go? Maybe go Spanish to English or.
Yeah, well, I'm fortunate that I work at a large nonprofit where we have individuals who provide services who are bilingual and really understand our culture. When I say our culture, I mean the large culture of New York City. So it's not just Latinos, but it's individuals from Asian countries, from all over, Russian. So I think we've actually done a very good job connecting with individuals, getting them on services. When I think about the biggest sort of challenge when I have conversations with them, when I say them, it's more the workers out in the field, it's the employment issue. It's people wanting jobs because the bulk of our services are geared for the adult population. And it's, you know, it's difficult times for everybody. But for those of you who sort of keep on top of disability statistics and employment, it is particularly challenging for the disability community. And that figure, it hasn't changed much in recent years. And I would say that is our biggest challenge. It's getting them ready and having the skills to really reflect the needs of the job market and employers, finding out where those openings are, and hoping that these employers are willing to give them a shot. What we do find is, again, it was discussed a little bit earlier, that if you have the exposure, if you have workers with disabilities at your site, you're likely to change your perceptions. But if you're not even allowing that to happen, you have a big strike against you as a nonprofit provider. We know that that's the group that we need to work with the most. And the other thing I sort of challenge our organization is having 1 or 2 people with disabilities in your workforce is just not enough. You need more. And oftentimes I hear companies talking about, well, we've got this one person who does this, or this one person. Well, I think it needs a little bit more than just one person. It's 1 in 5 Americans that have disabilities. I would expect you to set that goal for yourself and your workforce. So when I think about conversations that our workers have, I would say that's probably the one that's the most challenging.
You know, I was kind of struck that you said that New York had its first disability pride parade. I wondered whether Mayor de Blasio had anything to do with that. Were people with disabilities involved with the city and with the political change there? Did that help to create that kind of change?
I mean, I know he was present at the parade. A lot of nonprofit organizations were, so I can only imagine him along with the activists that are in the city had something to do with it. Yeah.
And in terms of, you know, the issues of social services and particularly jobs, you know, we're struggling for jobs in a corporate America that really controls the way society functions and who gets what. And we already know about the 1%. That redistribution of wealth affects us because there's no tax base anymore, no tax revenues for people in various states. Illinois is facing a tremendous challenge in trying to keep home services alive, something that we've struggled for, that we've gained a lot of independence through home services. We've gotten people out of nursing homes. But, you know, the political economic factors here are so important. Even in the amount of jobs people are getting, you know, I'm not very optimistic that all people with disabilities are going to find jobs, not in a capitalist economy. A capitalist economy is geared towards profit making. It's not about people, but it's not only disabled people that face discrimination and face marginalization. It's everyone. We're competing for jobs. And most people accept the idea that competition for jobs and competition in the economic system is a good thing. But there's also, and maybe there is, some benefit to it, but there's also the need for cooperative economies. And that's something that we need to grow, that we need to have a different model, a different vision, a vision of community. Maybe we have an advantage. We know about how tight-knit we are culturally, how tight-knit we are within community, and we have that collectivist spirit. But it's up to us really to work together and try to shape new things. I don't think we can rely on businesses, mainstream businesses, to get us the jobs. Some of it has to be that we create our own jobs, that we create our own businesses. We don't own very much. Independent living centers are unique not only because we serve people with disabilities, we're a majority run by persons with disabilities, our philosophies are different. They're unique because it's owned by the community. You know, that's the sense of ownership. People who come to Access Living and many other independent living centers across the country, we need to help to shape those independent living centers because some CILs have a service-oriented philosophy and not a political activist philosophy. That needs to change. And the only way that's going to change is if you do it, if we in community do it. And those of us who are immigrants going to those CILs and saying, hey, you know, I may not be a citizen here, but you know, I still am entitled to some services. There's some empowerment. They don't need Social Security numbers to go to a CIL, not for every service. Maybe for some home services or a service that is provided by government, funded by government. But for others, like empowerment trainings or even peer mentorship programs, every center does peer counseling. Let's insist that our CILs, those of us who are Latinos, insist that we be part of that. There's no, they should not be allowed to discriminate on the basis of race or gender or ethnic origin or nationality or language. You know, that's something that often gets overlooked too. There are civil rights requirements regarding language. You know, whether it's in a hospital setting or in a CIL, people are obligated to provide proper language access, appropriate access. And same thing for interpreters. People who are deaf, who are Latino, they end up in the hospital. Most of the time, they don't even know what's happening to them. They don't know what procedures are being conducted because there's no interpreters being provided. But we have to fight for it, and we have to insist on it. But we have to increase our knowledge base ourselves.
So I have a question. I know historically what the issues are that we need to know more about generally in the history of disability. But I wondered from, especially Brigida, because you do research and you have to come up with research questions and stuff. What issues do you think right now we need more information about? What is it we don't know that's hidden that we need to know to make policy or to know because as a historian, those are the things 10 years from now I'm going to be trying to find information on. So what do you think are the issues right now that we just don't know enough about?
Yeah. So when I think about even today's forum, I feel like this is just so historic. We're in DC celebrating the 25th anniversary of the ADA, and the Latino community is being discussed. That to me is historic. We've done it in pockets throughout this nation from time to time, but for it to be occurring as our nation celebrates this momentous act, for me, gives me sort of chills. And I would like to see more gatherings like this, but also reflections from the past. And I know, Catherine, I just made a comment to you that I think there should be an effort to gather stories that have already occurred throughout the US in different communities that are based on the Latino community and those with disabilities, because I know they're there. I know they're there because I was in Chicago as it was occurring, and I know others have stories that are very similar, and somehow gathering this and sharing it so that it becomes something public. As I tried to prep for today's talk, I did my own search and looked to see what was out there, and there just isn't a lot out there. And I didn't see anything out there by a Latino author. So I would love to see that. I mean, separate from that, only because I'm an employment researcher, I would love to see not so much about what are barriers to employment, because I think we've exhausted that line of research. I think we know what the barriers are. I like to see now funding toward employment practices that will really result in jobs. And I know that's going to take sort of creative thinking, but if the government can look not so much at what is inhibiting people from getting work, and what are the employers. But let's move it forward, and let's actually create opportunities here to really foster competitive employment. That's what I would like to see happen. I know, Fabrizio, you're doing a little bit of it in Chicago, and I don't know if you'll have the time to get on the speaker again, because I think it'd be interesting for the group to know what you're doing with individuals in Chicago in the area of self-employment. But I find that line of research fascinating because it's looking at employment in a different way.
Well, one of the things I know that the intellectual developmental disability community has been fighting for across the country is employment first policy.
Yeah.
And that's happening maybe even in your state. I think at least 23 states have already moved into an employment first model. And basically, that's trying to tear down some of the old institutions, which is kind of a first step. And that's sheltered workshops, which are segregated settings, and sub-minimum wages, where people with disabilities are making $5 a week, pennies a day. And those have to be relics of the past. They have to become part of ancient history. And I think parents are involved, professionals are involved, but we in the community, with those of us who are Latinos with disabilities and people with, who are not Latino, who have disabilities, we need to be there involved in the shaping of that policy. There's the idea of nothing about us without us, and that occurs too much. Sometimes policies get created. Most of the time, they filter down from the federal government down to the states and local areas, but they never have the impact they're intended to have. And some of them were bad policies to begin with. Ticket to work programs, for example. We researched some of that. You know, a lot of money is spent on creating policies and to implement policies and programs that have very little effect. Why? Because people with disabilities weren't consulted to begin with. Later on, when we conduct the research, we find out everything that went wrong. Of course, we just spent a lot of money, and I'm not doing this from a libertarian perspective or a conservative perspective, but we have to be wiser about the way we interact with research and policy and the inclusion of people with disabilities.
And we have done a better job, I think, as researchers. I wouldn't say all researchers do it, but there are participatory methods that some researchers throughout the nation are using, including Fabrizio and myself, where the research doesn't exist unless you have the expertise of the individuals that you're doing the research with, and that they should be active members of your team. And so I remember when I was funded a grant, we actually hired Rene for a year. Actually, I think you were with us for 3 years to serve as our expert person when it came to employment issues. And I think more of that needs to happen, not just on the research level, but on the policy level.
You know, and this is interesting. The methodology of participatory action research, PAR, is very common even in Latin America. We just don't call it that. I think some of you in Central America may be familiar with coyuntural analysis. That's very important, and it's a very similar model. And those are empowerment models. Paulo Freire, if any of you have ever read Pedagogy of the Oppressed, it's the idea of involving the peasants, involving the people, the working class people, in their own struggle. So it's not a unique methodology. It's just not widely used enough in academia. But we in the community need to be saying, yes, we need to be part of that analysis, because otherwise you're missing a large segment of community. I remember I was with Center for Urban Research and Learning at Loyola, and a researcher, a grad student, was out doing surveys on welfare reform change, the impact of 1996 legislation. And I said, well, did you interview any people with disabilities in your research? He says, you know, there was a few with mental illness, but I didn't deal with them. She ignored them. So she didn't get that perspective. So she missed an opportunity to have some rich data.
So I just want to mention that there are a number of best practices that researchers like Brigida and me have been working with and developing or trying out. With regards to employment, one approach is job development, which focuses on first identifying the strengths and abilities of the individual, unique, and then trying to identify specific employment opportunities that could utilize those skills. And then provide on-the-job supports to allow that person to fit that context through accommodations or through technology or through personal attendance support or on-the-job coaching, and then fade out gradually those supports, especially the coaching, and transfer that to coworkers and or regular employees or supervisors who can just simply monitor the successful fading into the job of the person with a disability. What is nice about this is that we have to build from strengths, not deficits. The other thing that we are trying with the support from the Department of Labor is self-employment. And there are two tracks to self-employment. The universe of individuals who have the capacity to run and operate a business by themselves, and the second option, which is cooperatives and small businesses and limited partnerships where groups of individuals with different degrees of abilities contribute to the operation of the business. What we found in our contextual analysis was, in dealing with the VR system, was that the system had built-in barriers because it was too much work for the individual counselors to actually develop these self-employment initiatives because of the caseload issue of the counselors. So what we did was to talk to the state, and they created a business incubator. We started piloting the business incubator in my office for a few months, but then eventually the state picked it up. And now the state has created the business incubator where they have people that are working with the persons with disabilities on developing the business plans, which are a requirement to getting the funding from the state. The outcome is that it's moving, businesses are starting, and different approaches are happening, and success is being met by different individuals. So it is encouraging that is happening. And I also mentioned in my presentation the other aspect about the internships and getting the kids early on those jobs. So people get educated, employers get educated, and the myth about working people with disabilities is gradually but substantially eliminated.
Questions?
Are there any other questions?
I actually have two specific and very quick questions. One, I'm not sure if you've covered this already, but I'm wondering if you could talk about the impact of social media as an activism tool and for connecting very disparate voices together in a chorus together to impact social change and to educate policymakers. Secondly, I'm wondering if you could also address talking about access to assistive technology as being very much part of getting somebody connected to a job and being really enhancing their productivity. Thank you.
I think social media is very important. Facebook pages, obviously. It's a way for people to connect locally and internationally. So that's very important. I know when we were fighting for Chuy Garcia as mayor, we developed a Facebook page, and people with disabilities joined that Facebook page. So we used it for political purposes as well. Not only is for community building and relationship building, or even not only for individual use, for that people can communicate, develop friendships, and that's very important. But to spread that knowledge about what's going on politically and economically. Obviously using Twitter, is that the?
Twitter.
Twitter? I don't use it, so, you know, I'm old, so I'm still catching up with some of the technology. But it's very useful in the disability community. Things happen rapidly. If you're at an ADAPT protest, for example, something's happening, you hear about it in seconds. You know, you don't have to wait till it comes out on mainstream media, if it even comes out on mainstream media. That's another thing. There's now an alternative to mainstream media, which I think is very important.
You know, as I was thinking about the question, I mean, I know we have a Twitter account, the YI Network. We have a Facebook account, and we're constantly updating it with updates. But I have to think whether we have this information in Spanish. I'm thinking of today's forum, and I don't think so. And it gives me something now to think about and to address with our organization if we don't, but I bet we don't. And then the other thing I was thinking as I was thinking about social media is, you know, it is sort of a generational thing. You know, you joke I'm old, right? Because there is sort of this generational component. So if you're not hooked into it, then how do you get the information otherwise? And that's something we need to just be aware of and attentive to, that it's not everybody who is socially connected or has access, because we are aware that there is a digital divide, especially among those who live in poverty and don't have the resources to really be socially internet connected when we think about social media. So just some thoughts.
Yeah. You know, in regard to the assistive technology and adaptive technology, there was a time when the state vocational rehab agencies would provide this type of equipment when necessary, because of cutbacks, economic issues, the redistribution of wealth. We don't have access, and we are much more limited in access. You know, you have to have some really strong advocacy take place to even get some of that technology. Some of the services, you know, we've gone backwards in many of our VR programs. Supported employment was not, I don't think supported employment's a new idea. It's been there with the Rehabilitation Act for a while. And counselors, not so much they don't want to use it. There's no money available for job coaches anymore. They've been defunded. Some of the internships that we've had that were paid internships have been defunded. So, you know, that we have to realize these political changes that are having nefarious effects on our populations, on our communities. But, you know, that's part of the digital divide. We're not being equal because some other people don't want us to be equal, you know? We don't think about it that way. We just think it happens, it's part of forces beyond our control. Well, you know, we keep thinking that way and change won't occur. Positive change.
Speaking of forces beyond our control, time waits for no person.
That's right.
And I believe it is our time.
Yeah. We're gonna de-mic and re-mic. A 10-minute break. And I know Mr. Luna has to go catch a train. So we'll take just a short break for all of us to stretch and for the interpreters to rest for a moment, and then we'll be back here in about 10 minutes. And the last session today will be very lively. It's about activism around disability in the history of the Latino community. So thank you all for coming. We'll take a quick break while we swap everybody out.